A couple of reasons we wanted to do this. First of all, I just wanted to test this system to see if we could run a meeting this way, and it's what?
You're muted. And
I'm muted?
no, you're unmuted. You're good.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to just work through this slowly and make sure that the system works. And then the other thing we wanted to talk about today is Lindsay and let me stop. Chairman, do you have anything to say before the meeting starts, or you just want me to dive in?
No, I think let's just get into it. I'm glad that this seems to be working a little bit, and I think everybody would just be aware of their mute button and then unmute button as we plow through this, I think.
Okay, very good.
So go ahead.
So we'll go ahead and get started. Lindsay and Kevin are here today, and I thought it'd be appropriate to just kind of summarize a bit regarding the federal stimulus monies that are out there. And there are three, as we know today: coronavirus, preparedness and response, supplemental appropriation, Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and then the one we're going to spend the most time on today is Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act. Since that, in the state of Kansas, as you know, Sedgwick County and Johnson are receiving direct installments of that, and we expect the first half of that installment imminently, sometime this week potentially. We did make application for it last Tuesday, and confirmed that our application was in through a variety of mechanisms, so we are in queue. Today's discussion, Lindsay and Kevin will keep it at pretty high level. Just talk about the purposes of the money, and then tomorrow on the agenda, on the official agenda, is an opportunity for the commission to weigh in one last time, and I'd like to see some type of either vote to accept and move ahead, and give staff or someone the order to figure out how to administrate it and manage it. And as we all know, with federal dollars of any sort, you have to be accountable and prudent with the money, and have a good paper trail and good documentation. So staff will be working on that with of course your blessing tomorrow at the meeting. So with that, who's first? Is it going to be Kevin? All right, very good. Kevin Stamper will come up, and we'll go from here.
Good morning, Commissioners. Kevin Stamper, Assistant County Counselor. Wanted to go through and provide a brief overview of the three acts that have already been passed. The first of those is the Coronavirus Preparedness Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. That was signed into law on March 6th and provided $8.3 billion in basically what amounts to emergency response. Of that 8.3, 6.7 billion is for use domestically, and the majority of the funding goes to Department of Health and Human Services and CDC. The lion's share of that, it was to be provided for testing, supplies, vaccines, grants to the local health centers, and there are some other smaller grants here and there that are subject to application. The second act is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and we talked about this in previous meetings. A lot of that was related to the emergency family leave and emergency medical leave. There are also additional funds in there that include enhanced WIC payments, SNAP payments, and Meals on Wheels and food bank things, that sort of thing. KDADS is apparently administering some of that money and has already distributed some of that money. The bill also included some enhanced Medicare funding. There is going to be a waiver of co-payments and deductibles for COVID-19 treatment through the federal government and most insurance plans. And it creates some state options for receipt of full funding matches from the federal government for COVID-19 testing and testing-related expenses. And the big one is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. and that's the CARES Act. That was signed into law on March 27th. The primary component of this that I know we're all interested in is the Title V funding in there. All 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories have received basically what amounts to block funding. And then any local government entity that is over 500,000 also received independent funding. Our funding will be in the neighborhood of about $99.6 million. And the funding must be accounted for as subject to Inspector General review. The money can be used for anything that's been deemed a COVID-19 related expense. And so, that's a pretty broad category, almost big enough to drive a truck through. So at some point, they're going to come back and look at that expense and determine whether it's COVID related. But other than that, there are not a bunch of guidelines that have been placed on the use of those funds. Primary is that you can use it for any expense that's been incurred between March 1st and December the 30th of this year, and that it can't be something that has already been accounted for in the 2020 budget year. So that's kind of the 50,000-foot view of this, and I'm going to let Lindsay talk about the funding mechanisms.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm going to move this camera down a little bit because I'm a little shorter than Mr. Stamper. Okay. So, talking about the CARES Act then, what Kevin just described is the Title V funding. There are some other streams of funding that we have understood will be coming. Our election commissioner has already reached out about funding that's going to come to elections. The state of Kansas is aware of some dollars, though they, like many folks, the state included, have not yet determined the process for allocation. We know that there was unemployment insurance and those types of things included in it, necessary public health emergency, FEMA dollars, JAG dollars, some money for aging transportation, economic development funding that would kind of be outside of the direct purview of the county, but Brent Shelton, our deputy CFO, is working on that, as well as maybe some mental health dollars. But what we know the most about right now, as Kevin said, is the Title V funding, and that is that $99 million that he referenced. And so we do expect those dollars to be here anytime. What we intend to do, and we're working with legal to figure out if there are any logistical hoops we need to jump through and bring that to you at a later date. But back in 2009, in response to that 2008 downturn, we were able to establish a central fund called the Stimulus Fund, where those ERA dollars, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, I believe is what that stands for. But we essentially intend to recycle that. And so we would place those dollars there. To date, we have spent roughly $809,000, either directly or intended to. So we've put in a lot of orders for PPE and things like that, where we just maybe haven't received the goods yet, but the order is on the books. We also know that you all approved the COVID stipend, and so this includes both pay periods that you have approved of that. This most recent pay period had about $201,000 in total costs for that stipend, and so we expect that to recur next week. So we do believe that these costs that we're tracking in our COVID-19 Fund Center and the general fund, we have a corresponding one in the fire district. We are trying to be very careful and get approvals for all of those through the various mechanisms that Tom has set up for administration. And so we intend to reimburse the general fund out of those dollars. We do know that that $99 million will come in, and it is for restricted use. It does have to be for necessary COVID-related expenses incurred between March 1st and December 31st, so we still have some time. We don't yet know what the future holds for that. And of course, it can't have been included in the budget. And so far, all of the expenses that are going in that COVID-19 Fund Center are costs that were not included in the budget. And so we're working to make sure that stays. We know the state has an allocation as a part of the same CARES Act of $1.25 billion. Johnson County and Sedgwick County are receiving direct allocations, but the state is as well. As Kevin mentioned, we have only 2 pages of guidance right now. We anticipate getting more, but part of the discussion about our allocation will be how we manage that. So we know that we have a number of municipalities within, or local governments within our boundaries that do not receive direct allocations because they don't meet the 500,000 population. And so depending on what level of expense, that's something that the commission will need to decide. We also will need the state to be a player in that to understand what allocations will go to whom and from which pot of dollars. Is it the county's pot, the 99.6 million, or is it the state's pot, the 1.25 billion? And so that's a discussion that we will need to have with you. It is important to note that, as the manager referenced earlier, the CARES Act certification has been submitted. Through that submission, the chief executive of the county, which of course the county manager is the chief executive in that role, certifies that essentially he is going to ensure that those dollars are spent appropriately. So the risk that comes with that means that any dollars that then go out from the county, we must ensure that those are spent appropriately, because what we have heard, and if any of you were able to participate in the NACO call yesterday, we heard that there is an expectation that that would then become the county's debt to repay the federal government. So there is some considerable risk that comes with these dollars, and that's why, at least so far, for that COVID-19 Fund Center, in anticipation that we would get this reimbursement, we have had all of that check and balance. We also know, of course, that public assistance dollars through FEMA will be available at a 75% reimbursement rate. Those dollars can be used a little differently. We'll talk about that some other day. But right now, I think that CARES Act, the 99.6 million, as well as the state's allocation, is going to be where we need some pretty strong feedback and direction from our commissioners. So I'll turn it back over to Kevin to come up and talk about what is on the horizon, if that's okay, and then we can maybe get to that discussion.
Currently, there are a couple of different proposals that are in front of Congress. And the first one of those is what they're calling 3.5, meaning, this is the bill that's supposed to come back and fill in some additional funding for that Paycheck Protection Plan that was passed as part of the CARES Act. And what they're going to do is they're going to pop in somewhere in the neighborhood. I mean, there's discussions even as of this morning about how big that contribution is going to be to the PPP. And it's going to be somewhere ostensibly between $250 and $500 billion. This is also going to provide some assistance to hospitals, and additional assistance for testing purposes. There needs to be a new component for state and local aid. Under the 99.6 billion million that we're going to be getting, we're not allowed to use that to offset any sort of lost revenue. We're being kept on a little bit of a leash in terms of how that funding can be used. So there's some discussion about whether there will be some relief contained in this 3.5 bill or whether it would be in the next bill after that. The president has indicated that he supports providing additional assistance to state and local governments for the lost revenue from especially sales taxes, excise taxes, basically those use taxes that we have not been able to collect as a result of the shutdown, or at least they've been severely curtailed. So that's something that will either be discussed in conjunction with this 3.5 or more likely the next big bill after that. That might also contain infrastructure changes or updates and that sort of thing. Now, we participated in a NACO phone call yesterday. And one of the big problems that was being discussed is that there are certain narratives out there regarding funding to state and local governments. And the main point of discussion with that is that there's some belief that, well, maybe state and local governments have mismanaged their funds previously, so why do we need to give them additional assistance? And there's also a fallacy out there that maybe we want to keep shut down if we go ahead and receive that additional funding. And those are the two main narratives against which NACO is trying to push back and has asked for our assistance in terms of speaking with our congressmen and senators in order to go ahead and try to disabuse them of the notion that there's no more funding that is needed. The funding is needed because, as was discussed in the call, there are counties that have AAA credit ratings that don't think they're going to make it. They cannot withstand this crisis. So those are some of the issues that are being taken to Congress, and that NACO is urging us to have our vendors, anybody that we do business with, our suppliers, also go ahead and chime in as far as trying to get that aid cut loose to the counties so that we can use that for revenue replacement. So that's sort of what's on the horizon at the moment. These are, you're reading the tea leaves trying to determine whether something's going to be in this act or maybe in the next act, or whether it's going to happen at all. But those seem to be the likeliest possibilities at the moment.
Okay, so to kind of follow up on that then, we are in a position now where we think we have our ducks in a row, as well as we possibly can without that direction from the commissioners. We do have a financial assistance team that's been set up with internal staff, a number of folks from finance and legal, and of course we will loop in departments as we start to get a little more idea of what the dollars are, how they'll be spent, so that we can make sure we have good oversight. We have engaged services of 2 external vendors, a disaster recovery services, which kind of specializes in maximizing FEMA dollars, and if we set that up correctly, that will be reimbursable under the various stimulus acts. We also are engaging the assistance of a grant writer specifically for Sedgwick County. Those contracts are working their way through the system right now and should be assigned any moment, and that will basically be a way for us to go out and find every potential possible funding stream related to all of the various services that the county provides, and ensure that we're chasing down those dollars. And so where we're at with the commission is, of course, making sure you have given us authority to accept the $99.6 million that Kevin referenced, and then also maybe giving us a little bit of direction on what process and administrative rules, regulations, involvement of you all that we want. And so with that, I will turn it either over to Tom or the chairman, depending on who wants to speak first.
Lindsay, let me comment that that's very helpful. Thanks for the background. I think we all have, some pieces of this that we've picked up on along the way. So this is helpful. And I'm glad, I think you said you've been through this before back in 2009, and on making sure we have an audit trail.
The county has, however, I think this is unique in that in the way the funding has been distributed. Before, we were not necessarily a direct recipient of those dollars. Those were a lot of pass-throughs. That's a little bit different than how it's being structured this time, and so we may not be able to replicate exactly what we had before.
Okay. Thank you. I'll mute.
Well, I'll just chime in to what Lindsay said. I think the guidance, I think what the commission needs to think about between today and tomorrow when we put this back on the agenda is, the breadth of accepting this money and taking on the responsibility that Lindsay outlined on managing it and allocating it and spending it wisely and prudently so we do not jeopardize the county in any way, shape, or form. The process by which that's done, we will have to work together on over the next several days, and I'm hoping we'll begin to get some information from federal on rules and how to spend it. And as Lindsay mentioned, we have a team of, it looks like we have 9 people. I'm sorry, we have 8 people on what we call the Federal Stimulus Money Review Team. We're adding some experts in from the outside to assist us with that. So we got quite a team. We want to be very careful on this, and we want to be very accountable. So that process that we will lay out to manage this and work through it, I don't think needs to be done by tomorrow, but it will be discussed very heavily over the next several days, and we clearly want commission involvement in that. So I'll mute now.
Okay, any commissioners have some comments yet as we move on? And
I just wonder, do we have any of this in like a written form? Was it sent out? I mean, do we have any sort of documents that could show? I mean, the 200,000 that was for payroll, was that included in the 809,000?
Yes, ma'am. And we can put together some
Okay.
documents. We have not sent out anything yet, but I'd be happy to put together a summary that we can circulate to you all.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following this, but it just seems like there's a lot here that if we could have it maybe from how you disseminate the information, Lindsay, is easier for me to understand. So that would be helpful. If you
No
could
problem.
maybe just give me the notes that you're off now, that would be nice.
No problem at all.
I mean, I made my, okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
This is Jim. I just was wondering if Wichita's also got.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, well, Wichita also has expenses related to this. Do they have their own funds, or are they going through the county to account for their expenditures and we'll reimburse them? How's that going to work?
So for right now, I do know the city is tracking all of their expenses similarly to how we are, and we have been in touch with them. In fact, they reached out very early on in this process. The city council did approve up to $1 million for them in expenses similar to what you all authorized as well, where we created those COVID-19 fund centers. And I think they actually have the capacity to bond that and have that reimbursed if absolutely necessary. From a FEMA side, historically, we had made the request on behalf of all entities in the Sedgwick County. My understanding is that that process has now changed. And so instead of Sedgwick County putting in on behalf of everyone, it will be up to each individual non-for-profit, city, township, county to request public assistance on this CARES Act and the reimbursements for those costs. I think that's the discussion we still need to have. We know the state has received an allocation. We know the county has received an allocation. And I think there still needs to be clarification on which entity is responsible for the oversight, the distribution, and all of that. And so I think that's still a discussion that's yet to be had, Commissioner. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I'm just thinking about, there's probably some things we're doing jointly with them. For example, the sanitation efforts on our EMS vehicles at Century 2, for example. I have no doubt there's a cost there.
Absolutely.
So I don't know how you account for that, but it's going to take some special handling, I think.
Agreed. And we do know that our EOC folks, when they were putting together their supplies earlier in this process, that did include requests on behalf of the cities. Now, whether or not that has been the process throughout, whether the city has needed to go out and get their own, pursue their own types of expenditures, I don't know. But we can follow up with them and certainly get you more information.
Well, it sounds to me like, unlike the ARA money that was in 08 and 09, this is very, very narrowly focused on COVID. So we got to be very careful, and I'd say use the word conservative on how we account for our expenditures here, because it sounds like if we don't do this right, we'll have to pay it all back. And so I think, Tom, I know you're doing a good job. Things that pop up, obviously, are things like PPE, anything that relates to testing in any way, or sanitizing our equipment, taking care of our people. Those are obviously good things, but outside that, I don't know what else relief we would get from this CARES money from the county.
So, excuse me, Commissioner, I think some of the things we're looking at is whether some of the outdated, maybe not outdated, but getting to that point, equipment on ambulances, if that could be a way we potentially use these funds. Just because, again, we know COVID-19 is not over. We know there's not a vaccine. This will allow us to be reimbursed all the way through December 31st for any expenses. So as this continues, its many twists and turns, we can be responsive. We do also plan to seek reimbursement for the COVID stipend. At this point, there isn't any guidance that would say, no, we can't, but certainly we'll be mindful in keeping an eye open to that because, like you said, we don't want to have to repay the federal debt or the federal government with this as debt with interest.
Right. I agree. Thank you.
This is David. The biggest question I have is, are the commissioners going to have a chance tomorrow to weigh in on the oversight group that they're going to look at this $99 million and how that we're going to spend it? We need to have people from the community that are involved in that. I want to make sure that the commissioners have a way of guiding the direction that we go on the oversight.
Oh, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's your money, but I'll defer to Tom if he has maybe a vision or anything for how that ought to look, or I know we've certainly talked about options.
Yeah, that's let me go back to Commissioner Howell's statement just a little bit, and then I want to talk about what you just said, Commissioner Dennis. There's a number of joint efforts that we are doing with mostly Wichita City, but all other cities as well. For example, PPE acquisition is a county effort being managed by Rusty and a team of people that service 127 different partners within the county. We'll take the brunt of that expense. That's the kind of expense that I think this money is geared for. You mentioned, Commissioner, the Century 2 sanitation effort. We have an effort going right now where we are leasing, or will be able to lease certain hotel rooms for all first responders in Sedgwick County. That's Sedgwick County people, Wichita, Derby, that first responders that come into contact with the virus and choose to quarantine not at home. So those are the kinds of projects that we are jointly working on, and this funding will help us pay for, quite frankly. I've talked with Bob Layton frequently. They are keenly aware that they need to data track money that's going out, and ideally any money that's being spent by municipalities is being run in front of the EOC group that meets weekly, so that it's out there, that we know they're spending it, and that they can properly track it. And then the trick, and Lindsay alluded to this a bit, is to make sure that we channel all of these streams of money to the right expenses. So the things that we can spend on FEMA money and get money back from FEMA, we need to target. And then whatever's not included under that comes under the CARES Act. So we'll just need to strategically look at all options to pay for any expenses that any of our municipalities in Sedgwick County or Sedgwick County itself incurs during this process. So that will be a work in progress, and we are on top of that. Commissioner Dennis, to your statement, yes, there is clearly has to be some level of oversight. Lindsay and Kevin and I have talked about this. I think at the end of the day, the true oversight component of this is maybe a group of auditing people or auditing functionality. There maybe needs to be a group underneath that is made up of community members, as you say, so that they can weigh in. We'll flesh out how that is going to look. But at the end of the day, this is so important, and we have such a zero-sum game on making any mistake here that I would feel comfortable if we had, an auditing firm as part of this group that could help and guide us and keep us square. And then they don't have a dog in a fight. Citizens, or even if we formed a government team, with a mixture of county and city and class 2 and 3 city components, Lindsay's concern, and I think it's valid, is that those could all be recipients to the money, and they should not necessarily be in the decision seat at that point. It's good to have either a group of citizens directed by the commission or at least an auditing function within that system. So we'll flesh that out. I don't know if we'll be ready for that tomorrow. We might. We could definitely discuss it in the open meeting tomorrow. But I think that that will flesh out over the next few days, and we clearly want commission involvement in that and deciding who's going to be on that panel or whatever we're going to call it.
Can I add a couple things? David, maybe why don't you and I call Ed Eilert, find out what their commission feels in Johnson County, since we're the only two that are getting this money. And to Lindsay and the attorney, maybe you can also call your counterparts in Johnson and find out what how they're reading this. Yeah, I think you were on the call when I talked to Ed last week. They were just looking at it initially, just like we were trying to determine the rules. So now everybody's had a week to work on it. We could find out from a commission standpoint between David and I, and then you could also talk to your counterpart at the CFO level. Just a suggestion.
So absolutely. And in fact, after that call last week, the finance director for Johnson County actually reached out and was inquiring the process we were using. And so I think we do want to be on the same track. There's absolutely that intention. I think we're both right now kind of trying to get the feel from the commission about how our commissions would like us to proceed to give us kind of that policy directive.
Okay, thank you. And on the second of two things is I know that the state, whatever the committee is under the governor's office, is meeting Wednesday, tomorrow morning. There's no percentage and there's no process yet set that they want to confirm on how any of the state money is going to get to local counties. Obviously not us, but local cities. So the rumor of 55, 45 split, all that stuff, there's nothing defined yet. So we will know more tomorrow afternoon, I believe, on the guidance that they're going to want to take.
And I think
we can relay that back to Bob and others.
Very good. Commissioner O'Donnell, you're out there. Do you have any comment or question, sir?
I am out here. Nope. I've enjoyed the listening. It was very interesting.
Chairman, that's really all we had today. Any other questions, or I guess up to you now on where you want to go with the meeting. That was really the only agenda item we had to talk about. And as that will be on the agenda tomorrow, we can have further discussion as you guys absorb the information from today.
Sure. Okay, that's good. I think that was good background for us. Thank you, everybody, for adding. I don't know if there's any other comments. David, I've got a couple of phone calls I need to make, then I'll call you and we can try to three-way Ed on, if that's all right.
That's great. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, Lacey, Jim, you got anything else to add?
I don't, other than the fact that I would like to see us talk about our plans after May 1st and May 3rd. What are we planning to do? We ought to have that discussion sooner than later. We're doing that tomorrow, or what's the plan?
Let me go look at it. It is tomorrow. It's going to be C on the agenda tomorrow, discussion of stay-at-home and gathering orders. I think this is going to go in two phases too. Tomorrow, we would have a very general discussion. That discussion will come after Adrian's normal report and Rusty and Tim's normal reports. So I think tomorrow we have a 30,000-foot discussion to hear what commissioners have to say. And then on April 29, I think I sent you all an email that we will have to plan on having a meeting on April 29. Then I think we get into lower to discussion of what it's going to be moving forward. We'll have additional weeks data. The infection will be progressed a little bit more. We'll have a little bit more information. I don't know if you caught the daily briefing yesterday, but the health department yesterday had over 90 set up for just yesterday, which is a considerable increase. So we're going to begin to get a little bit more information on what's going on out in the environment. And then like on the 29th, though, I see that as the discussion where we're going to need clear policy moving forward. We will have Dr. Mins at the 29th meeting. But for tomorrow, just a global discussion, kind of what you guys are thinking. maybe what you're hearing from the community, and we can have a pretty high-level discussion tomorrow. So to answer your question, yeah, we'll begin discussing it in earnest tomorrow.
And we'll be meeting in the boardroom as usual, correct?
Yes, sir. We'll do, although I think this is working out well, I think for tomorrow, we'll set it up just like we had last week.
Okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. Lacey, anything?
I'm good to go. I appreciate all the feedback today. Lindsay, I do want those documents, but other than that, I'm good.
Not a problem. I have a note.
And Lindsay, the wood panel behind you really looks good in the background.
Well, I figured you'd rather look at that than my smiling face.
All right. All right, everybody. If we don't have anything else, Tom, any closing statement, we'll X out. Thank you.
Nope, we'll be here today. Call if you need something. Thank you for doing this.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye.